The galaxy had always been a crowded place. Hundreds of species had crawled out of their oceans, climbed down from their trees, or slithered from their caves and looked up at the stars. Most of them had done it millions of years before humanity ever learned to walk upright. By the time humans figured out how to leave their little blue world, the rest of the galaxy had already built empires, fought wars, signed treaties, and settled into a comfortable order they called the Galactic Concord. Humanity joined the Concord in the year 2251. They were the youngest species at the table, and everyone made sure they knew it. The Concord was ruled by three ancient civilizations known as the Triad Primarchs. The Velishari were tall, luminous beings whose skin glowed with shifting colors that reflected their emotions. They considered themselves the galaxy's philosophers and moral compass. The Dreth Collective was a hive-mind species, billions of individual bodies sharing one vast consciousness that thought and moved as a single organism. They were the galaxy's engineers, builders of megastructures that spanned entire star systems. And then there were the Orca, a race of massive stone-skinned warriors who had conquered half the galaxy before the Concord existed, and had agreed to stop only because conquering the other half seemed like too much paperwork. Together, these three species made the rules. Everyone else followed them. And for nearly a century, humanity followed them too. It was not because humans were weak. It was because they believed in something the older species had long forgotten. The idea that kindness was not the same as weakness, and that offering a hand in friendship was braver than raising a fist in anger. Ambassador Ilara Voss had spent 30 years proving this belief to the galaxy. She was a small woman with silver hair and calm brown eyes, and she had walked into more hostile rooms than most soldiers had walked into battlefields. She had negotiated trade agreements, mediated border disputes, and once talked a Velishari war fleet into standing down, simply by asking their commander a question he could not answer. What will your children think of you tomorrow? Under her guidance, humanity had become something rare in the Concord, a species that was genuinely liked. Humans shared their terraforming technology freely, helped struggling colonies rebuild after natural disasters, and sent medical teams to fight plagues on worlds they had no obligation to care about. When the Cathari, a small and quiet species of feathered beings, were dying from a virus that their own scientists could not cure, it was a human research team that worked for 2 years straight to develop a treatment. The Cathari never forgot this, but not everyone saw humanity's generosity the same way. In the private chambers of the Triad Primarchs, far from the public eye, a different conversation had been growing for decades. It started as a whisper and slowly became a roar. They grow too fast, Primarch Sorath of the Velishari said during one such meeting. His skin flickered between shades of deep violet, the color of anxiety. When they joined us, they had 12 colony worlds. Now they have 67. In another century, they will have more worlds than the Velishari. The Dreth Collective responded through its speaker, a drone designated to translate the hive mind's thoughts into words other species could understand. The collective has calculated the growth trajectories. At current rates, humanity will become the dominant economic power in the Concord within 80 years. This is unacceptable. The Orca representative, a scarred old warrior named Grath, simply cracked his stone knuckles. I have watched young species rise before. If you let them grow roots, you will never pull them out. And so the Triad Primarchs began to plan. They called it the Partition Accord, a secret agreement to divide humanity's colony systems among the three Primarch species. The Velishari would take the outer colonies. The Dreth would absorb the industrial worlds. The Orca would claim the military outposts. Earth itself would be placed under protective administration, a polite way of saying occupation. Humanity would not be destroyed. They would simply be reduced scattered, weakened, and made dependent on their new masters. But first, they needed humanity's military out of position. The invitation came wrapped in smiles and warm words, as all the best traps do. Primarch Sorath personally contacted Ambassador Voss and proposed a joint military exercise in the Tyrant Expanse, a vast and unclaimed region of space on the galaxy's edge. The Expanse was rich in stellium, a rare energy source that every civilization wanted, but no one had claimed because the region was too far from any homeworld to defend. A joint exercise there, Sorath explained, would demonstrate the Concord's unity and strength. Voss brought the proposal to the United Earth Council. There was brief debate, but the decision was clear. Humanity had always participated in Concord exercises. Refusing now would look suspicious and unfriendly. The Council approved the deployment of a small peacekeeping flotilla, 20 ships under the command of Admiral Cale Marin. Marin was not a man who enjoyed war. He was 63 years old, with a lined face and tired eyes that had seen more conflict than he cared to remember. He had fought in the border skirmishes of the 2290s and had led the humanitarian mission to the Kethari homeworld. He believed, deeply and stubbornly, that the purpose of a military was to make war unnecessary. His crew loved him for this. His superiors sometimes worried about it. His fleet arrived at the Tyrant Expanse on a Tuesday. Not that days of the week meant much in deep space, but Marin kept Earth time on his flagship, the UES Avalon, because it helped his crew feel connected to home. Over 600 warships from the 3 Primarch species were already assembled. Velishari light cruisers with their elegant curved hulls, Dreth swarm carriers buzzing with thousands of smaller craft, and Uarka dreadnoughts that looked like floating mountains of dark metal. Marin's 20 ships settled into their assigned positions among the Allied formation. For 2 days, everything went according to plan. The fleets ran combat drills, practiced coordinated maneuvers, and exchanged technical data. Officers from different species shared meals and stories. On the surface, it was exactly what Sorath had promised, a celebration of unity. But Admiral Marin had not survived 30 years in uniform by ignoring his instincts. On the evening of the second day, he stood alone on the Avalon's observation deck, staring out at the assembled fleets. Something was wrong. He could feel it the way an old sailor feels a storm before the sky changes color. He pulled up the fleet positioning data on his personal tablet and studied it carefully. The Allied ships had shifted during the last drill rotation. The movement was subtle, so subtle that the tactical computers had not flagged it. But Marin saw it. The Velishari cruisers had moved to block the most direct FTL escape routes. The Dreth swarm carriers had spread into a wide net formation. The Uarka dreadnoughts had positioned themselves directly behind the human ships. It was not a drill formation. It was a kill box. Marin lowered his tablet slowly. His hands were steady, but his heart was beating fast. He activated his private comm channel to his first officer. "Commander Torres," he said quietly, "wake the crew, all of them, and do it without making a sound." The first shot came at 0347 hours, Earth Standard Time. It was a Velishari plasma lance, a beam of superheated energy that cut through the darkness of the Tyrant Expanse like a blade of white fire. It struck the UES Herald, a light frigate on the outer edge of the human formation, and split the ship in half. The 2 pieces drifted apart in silence, glowing orange at the edges where the metal had melted. There were 64 people on board. None of them survived. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. The human crews stared at their screens in disbelief. Some of them thought it was a malfunction, an accident, a terrible mistake. Then 600 alien warships opened fire at the same time, and there was no room left for hope. Admiral Cale Marin was already on the bridge of the Avalon when the shooting started. His quiet warning to Commander Torres had given the crew precious minutes to reach battle stations, but minutes meant very little against those odds. The Avalon shook violently, as energy beams and kinetic rounds hammered its shields from 3 directions at once. "All ships, evasive pattern Omega," Marin shouted into the fleet channel. "Break formation, and run for the nearest FTL corridor." But the FTL corridors were already blocked. The Velishari cruisers sat across every exit like locked doors, their weapons hot and ready. The Dret swarm carriers had released thousands of small attack craft that filled the space between the human ships like a cloud of angry insects. And behind them, the Orca dreadnoughts advanced slowly, their massive forward guns charging with a deep, vibrating hum that every human crew could feel in their bones. As the trap closed, every screen in the galaxy lit up with the same broadcast. Primarch Sorath appeared, his skin glowing a deep and steady gold, the Velishari color of righteous conviction. He spoke calmly, as if he were announcing a change in trade policy rather than the destruction of an entire species' future. "Citizens of the Galactic Concord," he said, "for nearly a century we have welcomed humanity into our family of stars. We gave them knowledge, we gave them trade, we gave them a seat at our table. And in return, they have spread across our galaxy like a vine that chokes the tree it climbs. Their growth is unsustainable. Their ambition is dangerous. Today, the Triad Primarchs invoke the Partition Accord. Humanity's colony systems will be redistributed among the Primarch species for the safety and stability of the Concord. Resistance will be met with appropriate force. This is not an act of war. This is an act of preservation." He said all of this while human ships burned in the background of his broadcast. On the Avalon, Marin watched the message, with blood running down the side of his face from a cut caused by falling debris. Around him, his bridge crew fought to keep the ship alive. The shields were failing. 2 of the main engines were gone. The weapon systems were firing on automatic, hitting anything that came close. But there were too many targets and not enough guns. "Admiral," Commander Torres said, her voice tight with controlled fear, "we have lost 9 ships. 3 more are critically damaged. We cannot win this fight." "I know," Marin said. He was quiet for a moment. The ship shuddered again as another volley struck the hull. Somewhere below decks, he could hear the sound of metal screaming as bulkheads collapsed. He thought about his daughter on Earth. He thought about the 64 people on the Herald who had been alive 5 minutes ago. He thought about Ambassador Voss, who had spent her life building bridges to species that were now burning them. Then he made his decision. "All ships, this is Admiral Marin. Begin emergency FTL jump calculations to solve space. Every ship that can still move, get out now." He paused, then added, "Avalon will cover your retreat." Torres looked at him. She understood what he was saying. The Avalon was the largest ship in the flotilla. It could absorb punishment that would destroy the smaller vessels. But absorbing that punishment meant staying behind, and staying behind meant dying. "Commander," Marin said gently, "get to the escape pods. Take as many people as you can." "Sir, I am not leaving this bridge." Marin almost smiled. "That was not a request, Torres. Someone has to survive to tell them what happened here. That someone is you." He turned away from her and activated every sensor and recording device on the ship. Every camera, every data log, every external feed. He dumped it all into a continuous broadcast on every open channel. Military, civilian, commercial, diplomatic. He wanted every species in the galaxy to see exactly what was happening. He wanted them to see the Velishari firing on unarmed escape pods. He wanted them to see the Dreth swarm fighters chasing wounded ships. He wanted them to see the Urukad dreadnoughts crushing a frigate that had already surrendered. He wanted no one to be able to say they did not know. The Avalon fought for 11 more minutes. In those 11 minutes, 6 human ships managed to reach FTL speed and escape the kill zone. The remaining ships, 14 in total, including the Avalon, were destroyed. In the final moments, as the bridge collapsed around him and fire consumed the corridors of his ship, Admiral Marin recorded one last message. He was calm. His voice did not shake. His eyes, reflected in the cracked glass of his command screen, were steady. "This message is for Earth," he said. "This is Admiral Cale Marin of the UES Avalon. We were betrayed. The Triad Primarchs planned this from the beginning. They smiled at us while they loaded their guns. I am sending you everything. Every sensor log, every communication intercept, every second of footage. The galaxy will see what they did here today." He coughed. The air was getting thin. Somewhere behind him, a support beam fell with a crash. "Do not mourn us. Do not forget us. And whatever you do, do not let them smile again." The transmission ended. 12 seconds later, the Avalon broke apart. The 6 surviving ships limped back to Sol space over the next 48 hours. They arrived battered, burned, and carrying fewer than half their original crews. Commander Torres was among the survivors. She delivered Admiral Marin's final recordings personally to the United Earth Council. The footage spread across human space within hours. Every colony, every station, every settlement with a screen watched it. They saw the first shot strike the Herald. They saw the kill box close. They saw escape pods being targeted. They saw Admiral Marin's face in those final moments. Calm, bleeding, unbroken. On Earth, billions of people watched in silence. The silence was the most terrifying part. There was no panic. There was no screaming. There was no chaos in the streets. There was just silence. The deep, heavy silence of 8 billion people arriving at the same conclusion at the same time. The silence lasted for one full day. Then Chancellor Davi Okafor called an emergency session of the United Earth Council. He stood at the podium and looked out at the assembled representatives of every human colony and settlement. His face was hard. His voice was harder. "I have watched the footage from Tyran," he said. "I have watched it 4 times. I wanted to make sure I was not mistaken about what I saw. I was not." He placed his hands flat on the podium. "For 100 years, we reached out to the galaxy with open hands. They answered us with fire and lies. Admiral Marin asked us not to let them smile again. I intend to honor that request." He paused. "Activate Project Prometheus." Deep beneath the Sahara Desert, in a bunker that had been sealed since the unification wars of the 22nd century, ancient machines rumbled to life. Lights flickered on in tunnels that had not seen light in 200 years. Dust shook from the ceiling as power surged through systems that had been waiting patiently and silently for exactly this moment. A massive steel door, 10 meters thick and bearing the scars of a forgotten age, began to grind open. On the wall behind it, stenciled in faded red paint, were 3 words that the galaxy was about to learn to fear. Project Prometheus. Activated. The galaxy expected humanity to collapse. That was the plan, after all. The Triad Primarchs had calculated everything with care. Destroy the military fleet at Tyran. Broadcast the partition accord. Move occupation forces into human colony systems before the shock wore off. By the time humanity recovered enough to respond, the Primarchs would already be sitting in their living rooms. But something went wrong with the calculation. The Primarchs had studied humanity's economy, their military strength, their population numbers, and their diplomatic relationships. They had not studied their history. If they had, they would have known that humanity had a very old and very dangerous habit. When pushed to the edge, they did not break. They got quiet. And then they built something terrible. Project Prometheus had been born in the early days of humanity's membership in the Galactic Concord. It was the work of a small group of military strategists, scientists, and engineers who had looked at the galaxy and asked a simple question that no one else wanted to ask. What if they turn on us? The Concord's leaders had been welcoming. The diplomatic channels were open. Trade was flowing. But these strategists, paranoid, brilliant, and deeply familiar with human history, knew that alliances were only as strong as the interests behind them. and interests changed. So they built a contingency. Over the course of 90 years, in absolute secrecy, humanity constructed a hidden fleet. The ships were not built in orbital shipyards where Concorde satellites could see them. They were built inside hollowed-out asteroids in the Oort cloud, the vast and frozen graveyard of rock and ice that surrounded the Sol system at its farthest edge. No Concorde sensor network reached that far. No alien diplomat had ever had reason to visit. It was the perfect hiding place. The fleet was not designed to be elegant or diplomatic. It was designed to win. Each capital ship was a fortress, massive, ugly, and bristling with weapons that humanity had never shared with the Concorde. Kinetic lance arrays that could accelerate tungsten rods to 80% of the speed of light. Singularity torpedoes that created tiny, short-lived black holes on impact. Phased null shields that bent energy weapons around the hull like water flowing around a rock. The Concorde's standard plasma lances, which could cut through any known defense system, would splash harmlessly against these shields like rain on glass. The fleet had been maintained by a rotating skeleton crew of volunteers who lived and worked in the Oort cloud in complete isolation, never speaking of their assignment, never contacting the outside world. They had trained in silence for decades, running simulations against every possible enemy, preparing for a day they hoped would never come. That day had come. When Chancellor Okafor gave the activation order, the fleet awoke like a giant rolling over in its sleep. Reactor cores that had been kept at minimal power surged to full output. Navigation systems locked onto pre-calculated jump coordinates. Weapon systems ran diagnostic checks and reported green across the board. Crew quarters that had housed a few hundred caretakers suddenly needed to accommodate thousands. And thousands came. Across human space, the call went out. It was not a draft. It was not a conscription order. It was a simple message broadcast on every human channel. Volunteers needed, you know why. They came from everywhere. Retired naval officers, civilian pilots, engineers, doctors, scientists, factory workers who had never held a weapon in their lives but knew how to keep a reactor running or patch a hull breach. They came from Earth, from Mars, from the asteroid belt colonies, from distant settlements on the edge of human space. They came because they had watched the footage from Tyron. They came because they were angry. And they came because they understood, in a way that the Primarchs never could, that this was not just about revenge. This was about survival. Command of the fleet fell to Fleet Admiral Rena Vasquez. Vasquez was 51 years old, with short black hair, sharp dark eyes, and a reputation that made even her own officers slightly nervous. She had spent her entire career in strategic planning, running war simulations against every species in the Concorde. She had gamed out invasions, defenses, sieges, and counterattacks in every possible combination. She had never commanded a real battle because there had never been a real battle to command. But in simulations, she had never lost. Not once. Not against the Velishari's speed, not against the Dret's numbers, not against the Orca's brute strength. When asked by a journalist how she felt about leading humanity's first true war fleet, she gave an answer that would become famous. I have been fighting this war in my head for 20 years. The only difference now is that the ships are real. While the fleet prepared, something unexpected happened. A small, unregistered ship appeared at the edge of Sol space, broadcasting a Cathari identification code. The ship was intercepted by a patrol cruiser, and its occupant brought before the Earth Council. The Cathari envoy was a slight feathered being named Tyrell. She stood before the council chamber, trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the effort of the journey. She had crossed half the galaxy in a ship barely larger than a shuttle, dodging Concorde patrols and jumping through uncharted space to deliver a gift. Intelligence. All of it. The Cathari had been a minor species in the Concorde, overlooked and ignored by the Primarchs. But being overlooked had its advantages. They had access to communication networks, logistics databases, and strategic planning files that the Primarchs had never bothered to secure against a species they considered irrelevant. Tyrell carried the complete operational plan of the Partition Accord: fleet deployments, supply line routes, communication codes, patrol schedules, defensive positions around every Primarch homeworld. She had everything. "You saved my people," Tyrell said to the Council, her voice soft but steady. "When the plague came and no one else cared, humans came to our world and fought for us. My grandmother survived because of your doctors. I am here because of your kindness. The Ketheri do not forget." Chancellor Okafor accepted the intelligence with a nod. Then he did something that surprised everyone in the room. He stepped down from the podium, walked to where Tyrell stood, and bowed to her. A deep, formal bow that in human culture was reserved for acts of extraordinary honor. "Tell your people," he said, "that humanity does not forget either." With the Ketheri intelligence in hand, Admiral Vasquez finalized her battle plan. It was precise, ruthless, and efficient. She divided the Omega fleet into 3 strike groups, each one tailored to exploit the specific weaknesses of a Primarch species. She assigned targets, calculated travel times, and established communication protocols that the Concord could not intercept. 6 weeks after the massacre at Tyran, the fleet was ready. The launch was something that no human who witnessed it would ever forget. 312 capital ships rose from the Oort cloud, each one the size of a small city. Behind them came 1,200 support vessels, carriers, supply ships, medical frigates, and electronic warfare platforms. And swarming around them like clouds of silver dust were 40,000 strike craft, small, fast, and deadly. The Armada moved inward through the Sol system, past the frozen outer planets, past the gas giants, past the asteroid belt. As it passed Jupiter, the fleet's engine signatures were visible to the naked eye from the observation decks of the Jovian stations. Workers stopped what they were doing and pressed their faces against the glass, watching the river of light flow past like a second Milky Way. On Earth, people stepped outside and looked up. They could not see the fleet, it was too far away, but they knew it was there. And they felt something that they had not felt since the footage from Tyran had first played on their screens. They felt hope. Across the galaxy, the Concord's long-range sensor networks detected the FTL signatures as the fleet jumped out of Sol space. The readings were enormous, far larger than anything humanity was supposed to be capable of fielding. Alarm signals cascaded through Concord military channels. Emergency meetings were called. Diplomats scrambled to send messages that would not be answered. On his private station, Primarch Sorath received the sensor report from his military advisors. His skin, which usually glowed with the confident gold of authority, flickered through a rapid series of colors, blue to green to white to a shade of pale, sickly gray that his aides had never seen before. His translator, designed to convert Velishari bioluminescent patterns into spoken language, processed the color pattern and produced a single word: fear. Sorath set the report down carefully. His hands were shaking. "How?" he whispered. "Where did they hide all of this?" The war lasted 3 months. In the long history of galactic conflict, that was barely the blink of an eye, but those 3 months changed everything. Admiral Vasquez began with the Velishari. She chose them first for a simple reason. The Velishari were the architects of the betrayal. Primarch Sorath had designed the Partition Accord, delivered the speech that justified it, and given the order to fire at Tyran. Vasquez believed in a principle she had learned from studying ancient Earth generals. Cut the head off the snake first, and the body stops moving. The first strike group, 104 capital ships and their support fleet, dropped out of FTL space above Velishar Prime on a clear morning. The Velishari homeworld was beautiful from orbit, a planet of silver oceans and violet forests, ringed by a network of elegant orbital stations that served as both military platforms and cultural monuments. The Velishari had built them over thousands of years. They considered them indestructible. They were wrong. The Velishari defense fleet scrambled to meet the human armada. 400 warships, twice the number Vasquez had brought, arranged themselves in the classic Velishari crescent formation, a sweeping curve designed to concentrate firepower on a single point. It was a formation that had won them 100 battles over 10,000 years. Vasquez did not give them the chance to use it. She opened with a single volley from the kinetic lance arrays. The lances were simple in concept. Tungsten rods, each one the length of a bus, accelerated to 80% of the speed of light by magnetic rails that ran the entire length of a capital ship. At that speed, each rod carried more energy than a nuclear warhead, and Vasquez fired 2,000 of them at once. The rods crossed the distance between the fleets in less than a second. They struck the Velishari formation like a wall of invisible hammers. Ships that had withstood plasma fire and energy beams for centuries were punched through from bow to stern, the rods entering one side and exiting the other, before the crews even knew they had been hit. Orbital stations that had taken decades to build shattered like glass ornaments dropped on a stone floor. The battle lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, the Velishari defense fleet had been reduced to drifting wreckage. The orbital stations were gone. The crescent formation, pride of the Velishari navy, had been broken into pieces so small that the debris field would circle the planet for 1,000 years. But Vasquez did not fire on the planet. Instead, she opened a broadcast channel to the surface. Her face appeared on every screen on Velishar Prime, in homes, in government buildings, in schools, in hospitals. She looked directly into the camera, and her voice was calm and flat, without anger or triumph. Your fleet is destroyed. Your orbital defenses are gone. I have enough firepower in orbit to turn your world into glass. I will not do this. We are not you. We did not come here to murder civilians. We came here to end a war that your leaders started. She paused to let the words settle. You have one planetary rotation to surrender your remaining military forces and hand over the architects of the partition accord. If you do this, your people will live, your cities will stand, your culture will survive. If you do not, I will be forced to continue, and I would prefer not to. The choice is yours. Velishar Prime surrendered in 6 hours. The second campaign was against the Dreth Collective, and it was an entirely different kind of war. The Dreth did not think like individuals. They were a hive mind, billions of bodies connected to a single consciousness. This made them incredibly efficient. A Dreth fleet did not need communication systems, because every ship already knew what every other ship was thinking. Their tactics were based on overwhelming numbers and perfect coordination. A swarm of 10,000 Dreth fighters could move as one organism, shifting and adapting in real time like a school of fish evading a predator. Admiral Vasquez had spent years studying the Dreth in simulations. She knew their strength was their unity. She also knew their weakness. The second strike group engaged the Dreth in the Kessler Corridor, a narrow passage of navigable space between two dense nebulae. The Dreth had positioned their main swarm fleet here, 8,000 ships of various sizes, from massive carrier hives to tiny fighter drones. They moved together like a living cloud, beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Vasquez deployed the Singularity torpedoes. Each torpedo was a marvel of physics, a device that, upon detonation, created a microscopic black hole that lasted for exactly 4.7 seconds before evaporating. In those 4.7 seconds, the black hole generated a gravitational field strong enough to crush anything within a radius of 50 kilometers. The human fleet fired 300 torpedoes into the Dreth swarm in a carefully calculated pattern that Vasquez called the Cascade. The torpedoes detonated in a rolling wave, each one creating a brief but intense gravitational well that sucked in everything nearby. Dreth ships were pulled apart like paper in a hurricane. Fighter drones crumpled into balls of scrap metal. Carrier hives, each one home to thousands of Dreth bodies, collapsed inward and vanished. But the real damage was not physical. It was psychological. The Dreth collective was one mind. When a Dreth body died, the collective felt it, a small pinch of loss in a vast ocean of consciousness. The collective had experienced death before. Individual bodies died all the time. It was normal. It was manageable. But the cascade killed thousands of bodies simultaneously, over and over, in rapid succession. The collective experienced not a pinch, but a scream, a continuous rolling wave of death that flooded its consciousness like static drowning out a signal. For the first time in its existence, the Dreth collective experienced something it had no framework to understand. Pain. Real, overwhelming, uncontrollable pain. The swarm fleet lost coordination. Ships that had moved in perfect unity began to drift, collide, and scatter. The single consciousness that controlled them was too overwhelmed by the sensation of mass death to maintain tactical control. Within an hour, the greatest swarm fleet in galactic history had disintegrated into chaos. The Dreth collective sued for peace before the day was over. The terms were simple: full withdrawal from all human systems and the surrender of all Partition Accord strategic assets. The collective agreed without negotiation. It wanted the pain to stop. The third campaign was Vasquez's masterpiece, and she won it without firing a single shot. The Orca Dominion had watched the destruction of the Velashari fleet and the collapse of the Dreth swarm with growing horror. They had always considered themselves the strongest military power in the galaxy, and they had prepared accordingly. Their homeworld and colony systems were protected by orbital fortresses, ancient, massive structures built during the Orca's age of conquest. Each fortress was the size of a small moon, armored with meters of composite plating, and armed with weapons powerful enough to crack a planet's crust. The Orca believed these fortresses were invincible, and they prepared to endure a long siege. Vasquez had no intention of besieging them. Instead, she used the Kethari intelligence. Among the files Tyrell had delivered was a collection of private communications between the Orca leadership, messages that revealed a secret the Orca had hidden from their Triad partners. The Orca had never intended to share humanity's colonies equally. Their plan was to let the Velashari and the Dreth do the hard work of subduing humanity, and then to turn on their allies and take everything for themselves. Vasquez transmitted these communications on every channel: Concord military frequencies, civilian broadcasts, diplomatic networks. She sent them to the Velashari survivors. She sent them to the Dreth collective. She sent them to every minor species in the Concord. And most importantly, she sent them to the ordinary citizens of the Orca Dominion, who had been told by their leaders that the war against humanity was a necessary act of self-defense. The reaction was immediate. On Orca worlds, public outrage erupted. The warrior culture of the Orca placed supreme value on honor, and betraying one's own allies was the deepest possible violation of that code. Protests broke out in every major city. Military officers who had loyally followed orders began to question the leadership that had given them. Garrison commanders on the orbital fortresses opened communication channels with Vasquez and asked for terms. One by one, the fortresses surrendered, not because their walls were breached, but because the people inside no longer believed in the cause they were defending. The Orca government collapsed within 2 weeks. The warrior Groth, who had cracked his knuckles so confidently when planning humanity's destruction, was arrested by his own officers and handed over to human custody without a fight. The war was over. Across the galaxy, the news spread like wildfire. The 3 most powerful civilizations in the Concord, species that had dominated the stars for millennia, had been defeated by the youngest member of their alliance in 90 days. It was not supposed to be possible, but it had happened. And perhaps the most frightening thing, the thing that kept alien leaders awake at night for years to come, was not that humanity had won, it was how they had won. They had matched each enemy's weakness with surgical precision. Speed against the Velashari, psychology against the Dreth, truth against the Orca. Admiral Vasquez had not simply beaten 3 empires. She had studied them, understood them, and taken them apart like a mechanic disassembling an engine, piece by piece, with calm and steady hands. It was, as one alien commentator later wrote, the most terrifying display of competence the galaxy had ever seen. The trial of the Triad Primarchs began on a space station that had once served as the Galactic Concord's diplomatic headquarters. The irony was not lost on anyone. The same hall where the Primarchs had once sat in judgment of lesser species was now the place where they stood as the accused. The station had been renamed. The old Concord emblem, 3 interlocking circles representing the Primarch species, had been removed from the walls. In its place hung a simple banner bearing the words Galactic Tribunal in 12 different languages. The message was clear. The old order was dead. Something new was being born. The tribunal was composed of judges drawn from species that had not participated in the betrayal. There were representatives from the Kethari, the Morvani, the Seleuci, and 4 other minor species who had spent centuries living under the Primarch's shadow. For the first time in galactic history, the small and the overlooked would pass judgment on the powerful. Primarch Sorath was brought before the tribunal in energy restraints, his glowing skin flickering between pale shades of green and gray, the Velashari colors of shame and resignation. He had aged visibly in the weeks since his capture. The confident gold glow that had illuminated his broadcast announcing the partition accord was gone, replaced by the dull, fading light of a being who understood that his story was over. But even now, he refused to admit he was wrong. "I did what was necessary," Sorath told the tribunal. His voice was steady, almost defiant. Humanity was growing too fast. In another century, they would have dominated the Concord, not through war, but through sheer numbers and economic power. Every projection showed this. Every model confirmed it. The partition accord was not an act of cruelty. It was pruning. You cut the branch that grows too fast to save the tree. The lead judge was Kethari, a senior elder named Valen, whose silver feathers were streaked with the darker colors of age. She listened to Sorath's defense with an expression that on a Kethari face was completely unreadable. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she spoke. "You say you pruned a branch to save the tree," Valen said, "but the branch you cut was the one that bore fruit for everyone. The humans gave us medicine when we were dying. They gave the Morvani water purification technology when their rivers turned toxic. They gave the Seleuci agricultural science when their crops failed. What did the Velashari give? What did the Dreth build for anyone other than themselves? What did the Orca defend besides their own borders?" She leaned forward slightly. "You did not prune the wrong branch, Primarch. You pruned the only branch that was holding the tree up." The courtroom was silent. Sorath's skin went completely gray. He had no answer. The tribunal found all 3 Primarch leaderships guilty of conspiracy, aggression, and crimes against a member species. Sorath and the senior Velishari commanders were sentenced to permanent exile on a barren moon at the galaxy's edge. The Dreth Collective's governing nodes were isolated and disconnected from the main consciousness, a punishment that, for a hive mind, was equivalent to solitary confinement. The Orca military leaders, including Grath, were stripped of rank and title and returned to their people as civilians, which in the warrior culture of the Orca was a fate worse than death. Justice had been served, but justice alone was not enough to rebuild a galaxy. Chancellor Davi Okafor understood this. He was an engineer by training, and engineers knew that it was not enough to tear down a broken structure. You had to build something better in its place. 3 weeks after the tribunal's verdict, Okafor addressed the galaxy. His speech was broadcast to every species, every world, every station and settlement from the galactic core to the outer rim. He stood at a simple podium on the tribunal station, dressed in civilian clothes rather than any kind of uniform. This was deliberate. He wanted the galaxy to see a builder, not a conqueror. 100 days ago, he began, humanity was betrayed by those we called friends. We lost good people. We lost ships. We lost something more precious than either. We lost our belief that the galaxy could be trusted. He paused and looked directly into the camera. We won the war that followed. We could have used that victory to do what the Primarchs did, to divide, to dominate, to reshape the galaxy in our image. Some of our people wanted this. I share it. Another pause. But we did not leave Earth and reach for the stars so that we could become the thing we just defeated. Humanity's strength was never our weapons. It was our stubborn, foolish, and sometimes painful belief that people, all people, of every species, deserve better than fear. He announced the formation of the Stellar Commonwealth, a new galactic alliance to replace the Concord. The Commonwealth would be built on 3 principles. First, complete transparency. No secret accords, no hidden agreements, no backroom deals. Every treaty, every trade agreement, every military arrangement would be public and accessible to every member species. Second, mutual defense. An attack on one member was an attack on all, and the response would be collective and immediate. Third, and most importantly, a single inviolable law. No member species shall conspire against another. The penalty for violating this law was not war. It was total isolation, economic, technological, and diplomatic. A species that betrayed the Commonwealth would simply be cut off from it, left alone in the dark to fend for themselves. We are not building an empire, Okafor said. We are building a neighborhood. And in this neighborhood, the only rule is that you do not stab your neighbors in the back. The response was overwhelming. Within days, 23 species had formally applied for membership. The Cathari were the first, and in recognition of their courage, they were given a permanent seat on the Commonwealth Council. Tyrell, the envoy who had risked her life to bring intelligence to Earth, was appointed as the Cathari's first representative. When she took her seat, the entire chamber stood, a gesture of respect that moved the small feathered being to tears. Even some Velishari, Dreth, and Orca populations applied for membership, having separated themselves from the governments that had led them to ruin. They were accepted, after review, because the Commonwealth was not about punishment, it was about the future. Admiral Vasquez oversaw the final act of the military campaign, the withdrawal of Omega Fleet. The warships that had shattered 3 empires in 90 days turned around and flew home, back to the Oort Cloud, back to the hidden docks inside their hollowed asteroids. The weapons were powered down, the crews were thanked and released to return to their families and their lives. A journalist from the Sol Broadcasting Network managed to get a rare interview with Vasquez before she disappeared from public life. He asked her why she was hiding the fleet away instead of keeping it deployed as a visible deterrent. Vasquez looked at him with those sharp dark eyes, and almost smiled. Almost. "A deterrent only works if they are afraid you will use it," she said. "They have already seen us use it. Now they just need to wonder if we built a second one." The journalist laughed nervously. Then he realized she was not joking, and he stopped laughing. On every human colony world, monuments were erected for the crews of the 14 ships lost at Tyran. The names of every person who died were carved into black stone. 4,217 names in total. Admiral Cale Marin's name was at the top of every list, and his final words were inscribed on the wall of the Commonwealth's Assembly Hall, where every diplomat and representative would see them each day as they entered. Do not let them smile again. Commander Torres, who had survived Tyran because Marin had ordered her off the bridge, visited his monument on the first anniversary of the massacre. She stood there for a long time, saying nothing. When a reporter asked her what she was thinking, she said, "I am thinking that he would have hated all of this. The monuments, the speeches, the fame. He just wanted to keep people safe." She touched the stone where his name was carved. He did. Life moved on, as life always does. The stellar Commonwealth grew. Trade routes reopened. Diplomatic channels hummed with activity. Slowly, carefully, the galaxy began to trust again. Not because the wounds had healed, but because the people involved had decided that healing was more important than holding grudges. But deep in the Oort cloud, past the resting ships of Omega Fleet, past the silent docks and the sleeping reactors, there was a second set of bunker doors. They were larger than the first. They were buried deeper, and they had never been opened. A maintenance drone passed them on its routine patrol, its sensors automatically scanning everything it encountered. It logged the reading, the stenciled label on the doors, the power signatures behind them, the faint hum of systems in standby mode, and transmitted the data to the maintenance archive, where it would sit unread among millions of other routine entries. The label on the doors read, Project Prometheus 2, Contingency Fleet Alpha. The drone moved on. The door stayed closed. The systems behind them continued to hum, patient and waiting, as they had been for a very long time. Humanity hoped they would never need to open them. But hope, they had learned, was not a strategy.